I know a few things. I think this is close to our 20th webinar in the past 8 weeks at Grantmakers for Education. So I know that folks fill in over the course of the first 5 minutes of the hour. But I want to respect our participants today and get us underway. So hi again, my name is Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education. Welcome to the second in a 3-part series on authentic community engagement. This session is focused on listening to and learning from leaders of color amid the COVID crisis. And we have 3 fantastic speakers today to reflect with us and answer some questions. So we have Xiomara Padamsee from Promise 54. We have Layla Avila from Education Leaders of Color, and we have Nick Donohue from the Nellie Education Foundation. So I just want to start us off with a couple of words about why we're doing this series and why we're doing this specific session. So number one, since I came on board at Grantmakers for Education about a year and a half ago, I've heard a growing interest among members on the topic of listening better and learning more from those who are most proximate to the communities that we seek to support. And so when I hear that, I hear real intentionality. I hear a real desire to do better as funders. But when I hear that, I also think that's really hard, and it's going to take a long time for us to really get into a good place on that. And I say that as someone who spent the last decade before my time at GFE working with a group that had less power, teachers, trying to get their voices heard by people who had more power, political leaders. And you know, I had lots of conversations with those in power who would say, you know, those power dynamics are really a shame, but it's hard to make them go away. So we're on a journey together from the talking the talk to figuring out how to walk the walk. And I think in the COVID crisis, it's really elevated this conversation for a variety of reasons. Number one, we're all operating with a great sense of urgency around how to reach a variety of vulnerable populations. We know that the COVID crisis has disproportionately impacted Black Americans. We know that there are immigrant and refugee communities that are more at risk under this administration. We know that there are greater risks of an increasing homeless population. And so equity overall is further at risk in this moment. And funders are saying, you know, we can't necessarily rely on listening to our most trusted partners, the ones that are the longest serving institutional players, the biggest nonprofits. We really need to reframe what we're thinking about in terms of trusted partners to be the partners who are most trusted by communities, who are most proximate to communities. And then the last way that the COVID crisis has really surfaced this issue is that many of you who are joining us today have been focused over the last several years in helping to diversify the leadership ranks in the nonprofit and education space. And we know that those are some of our youngest and most vulnerable nonprofits. And so we want to make sure that those remain healthy through this time. So I want to thank especially Xiomara and Layla for coming forward today for this conversation. It takes some bravery to be the people who carry the mantle for others who might be too early on in their nonprofit journeys or find it too risky to speak truth to power. It's risky, it's exhausting, it's hard to do. And so I want to honor that and say thank you for joining us today. And with that, I'd really like to turn it over to Xiomara to start. And I'd like for each of our panelists to kind of speak for 5 minutes. We're going to try to have a conversation where we answer a lot of your questions. I already see questions in the chat box. And then I'll ask some questions. We encourage the panelists to speak and ask questions of one another. But Xiomara, just Let's start off here by just going back to the beginning a little bit. Talk about your growth as a leader of color and the process of trying to fit the mold that funders expected, acknowledging that there are some costs to your identity. And I want to acknowledge that I saw you speak about this at New Profits Inclusive Impact Summit and was just learned so much from your comments and felt they were so poignant that I begged you to do this for our audience as well, because it's just so important. So I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm happy to. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope, well, afternoon on the East Coast anyway. I hope you and your loved ones are and remain safe and healthy in this crazy time. I am happy to share my journey as a leader of color in this space, and I'll do it in the form of what I call a radically human introduction. So my radically human introduction has to first start with an acknowledgement of those that came before me, because without their sacrifice, I really wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't be enjoying the privileges that have really become normal daily life to me. So I have to start there. I am a descendant of the indigenous Taino people of the Caribbean. They were, for anyone who's not familiar, voyagers and farmers who encountered Christopher Columbus in 1492 and were subsequently starved, enslaved, poisoned, died in war, or committed suicide until their extinction just 50 years later. My grandfather came to the U.S. mainland from Puerto Rico filled with hope, and instead he found a racialized society where being brown and poor meant that his family's access to health care and housing and food stability and safety and educational opportunity, even life expectancy, were all predetermined. He worked screwing toothpaste tops on Colgate tubes. We call them colgate tubes for decades, so that his kids could, unlike him, finish elementary school and go on to middle school and high school. My New Yorican mother from the South Bronx and my Muslim father from Bombay were both first generation to go to college in their families. They both went on to get their masters and their PhDs, and ultimately together through education, they broke the intergenerational cycle of poverty for our family. So what about me? I could introduce myself to you in terms of my degrees or work accomplishments, but none of that really makes me who I am in an authentic way. So I'm going to leave it to the Google search and tell you what really matters to me. I am Puerto Rican, or as we say, Boricua, and Cubana and Indian. I am gay and married. I'm a cisgender woman. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I speak fast, and I wear big hoops, and I use my hands. I am a wife, and I've been with my partner for 20 years. We have been illegally married for 8 years and legally married for 5. I am a mother to a smart, compassionate, sassy 7-year-old who is homeschooling downstairs and could make an appearance during our time here together. I have a long Spanish name, Xiomara. My X is pronounced like an S, and every syllable in my name is important to me. My name means ready for battle. I love making piñatas and knitting and listening to reggae and salsa and playing classical piano and watching Broadway musicals. I am a complex, intersectional being at the core. In terms of my experience, I came to educational equity and racial justice work immediately after graduating from college over 20 years ago. And I came on fire because I was sure I had become a revolutionary in college and I was ready to change the world. And what I found when I entered this space was that many, and maybe all of the organizations with influence in the educational equity space were deeply white dominant in their internal cultures and systems and habits and behaviors, and led by white folks. And so if I wanted to make my life worth breaking the predictive link between race and class and academic outcomes, if I wanted to be in the room when decisions were being made and plans were being created in service of my people, my family, my community, well, then I really believed that I had to assimilate into white dominant cultures. I believed that I needed to prove that I was smart enough and eloquent enough and controlled enough, strategic enough and measured enough, linear thinking enough, data-driven enough, structured enough, efficient enough, organized enough, professional enough. I had to prove that I was or could be white enough. And so I slowed down the pace of my speech and the rigor of my hand movements. I took off my big hoops. I chose my battles. I let my name be shortened for the convenience of others who were looking for a way around learning to pronounce it. I hid my tears from microaggression after microaggression in the bathroom. And over the course of 15 years, I left more and more pieces of who I really am behind. I covered and I assimilated. And I succeeded. I was promoted within those organizations into senior-most positions. I had access to information and resources and staff and decision-making authority to help inform impact for our communities and our kids. But the cognitive drain, the physical and psychological and emotional toll to me, it was really massive. And so I left it behind to found a new kind of organization, and that's what we're working to build at Promise 54, where I come to you from today. Internally, we're really working to create a countercultural, radically human organization. We're starting from a place of belief in the innate brilliance of each and every individual human, and then we're on an intentional and oftentimes really uncomfortable journey to interrogate the messages that we've learned and internalized about who's worthy and who's superior and who's enough and who's not. We're investing really deeply in our relationships with one another, and we're working to create an internal space that really embodies the kind of equity that we're trying to create in the field. And we're supporting lots of organizations across the education space, many of them foundations, in their own messy internal journeys to create thriving and inclusive cultures and equitable systems. So I guess I'll just leave it by saying I do this work because I believe really deeply that when we can each bring our full selves and find connection and psychological safety and trust and voice and agency, that's when we're going to be able to do our best work. And I really believe that under normal circumstances, getting to educational equity in the United States is going to take our best work, and these are not normal circumstances. To be honest, I feel like I have never, ever felt that more true, this mission, this calling to do this work, than in the past couple of months during this COVID-19 pandemic. So I can speak more to that as we go, but that's me for now.
Thank you so much, Xiomara. That was a fantastic introduction. I can see lots of cheering in the chat box, and I know you have a large fan club here, so thank you so much for that start. Layla Avila is also someone who I have heard tell her own personal story and felt incredibly compelled and inspired by. Layla both runs an organization, runs a nonprofit, and also is funding a series of earlier stage leaders of color on their own entrepreneurial journeys. And so I would love for you to introduce yourself, Layla, and touch on both of those hats that you wear.
Yep. Well, thank you for inviting us to this conversation. We feel very privileged to be in this group and see it as our responsibility to help elevate the voice of our members. As you mentioned, I co-founded and run Education Leaders of Color, which is an organization that helps to elevate the voice, the leadership, and the influence of people of color in education who are values aligned. I founded the organization with 17 other leaders of color who are people that probably have received funding at one point from people who are on this call. And it started with a conversation between Kaya Henderson, who at the time was the chancellor of DC Public Schools, Ami Eubanks Davis, who now runs Braven, and my co-founder, Shonda Bassier, who at the time was with Families in Schools. And really what we wanted to be able to do was to help identify what our role was as people of color in education reform. And what we saw was that there was obviously like a lack of representation, right? As you looked at the people who were being funded and the people who were sort of on the main stage in education reform, there's a lack of representation of people of color. But we felt like representation was not enough, that it was important that you had values-aligned leaders who were leading in different ways, such that the work that we were doing in ed reform is going to sustain. And at that point, we saw that there was the beginning of some backlash and sort of scratching our heads as to why communities of color were not with us when all the data was on our side, right? Why aren't communities of color with us? We have all the data on our side. And really what we also experienced as people of color was there was this backdrop of increased visible police brutality in our communities. We saw increased deportations in our communities, and us going to work every day in organizations that we deeply, deeply believed in their mission, but really a lack of attention to some of these issues that were upending the lives of the very people that we purported to be supporting in these communities, and sort of a lack of acknowledgement, a lack of conversation around those things. And the message that sometimes we received in these organizations was, we just have to focus on the work. You know, we just have to focus on the work. And for many of us, as people of color, we can't just focus on the work, because you're talking about our families, right? You're talking about our neighbors, our cousins, our godchildren, et cetera. And so we thought there's probably a role for us to play here in elevating these issues, while at the same, which are front and center for communities of color, while we are working to improve education. So we thought there has to be a third way. This became sort of the foundation of our third way values, to ensure that as people of color who believe in the importance of thinking beyond education, who believe in the work that we do, that is not just focused on increasing student outcomes, but essentially interrupting generational poverty, there has to be a space for us. And so we just started by having conversations with our networks. That resulted in our very first national convening, which included 75 people from across the country, just asking this question of, what's our role? Is there a role for us? You know, at that point, we didn't even know that we were going to become an organization. We then decided that we wanted to focus on leadership, because we know that who is at the helm of organization determines both what that organization does and how it goes about doing its work, which matters tremendously. We then wanted to figure out, okay, so if we're going to create this network, what is it going to do, and what is it going to, what is it, why is it different, right? Because every group of oppressed people always think that things would just be different if we were in charge, but we really wanted to articulate why it is that we would be different, and that became our second national convening, where we really identified the values that we wanted to ensure that we were advancing and elevating and supporting in the field. And we decided at that point to create an organization, all sort of very organically, with the people who we were talking about, with other leaders of color. At that point, we were all moonlighting and trying to uplift this organization. And we're very lucky that there were, through the various connections that we had in our previous jobs, we're able to get a couple of funders who, before we even knew we would become an organization, before we even knew who would lead the organization, who believed in what we were trying to do, and sort of seeded some of this work very, very early on. And it was all predicated on relationships that these 17 people, who was our original leadership committee, had. And so it wasn't lost on me that the investment that my previous organizations had made in me was helping me and the other 17 people stand up this organization. And what became clear to me is that not every person of color, not every leader of color in these various organizations has that kind of support. And I thought that it was our job as leaders of color who had some level of privilege of supporting others in that way. I was very lucky that one of my first managers after teaching in the Compton Unified School District was Michelle Rhee, Audie Rosman, Tim Daly, Dan Weisberg, people who, like, everybody knows have, like, lifted and expanded, you know, amazing work. One of my very first calls at TNTP around a recruitment campaign that I was running was with Michelle Rhee and Wendy Kopp, right? Like, who gets that opportunity? Not a lot of people do. And I felt it was my responsibility and our collective responsibility to do that for other leaders of color, because so much of our successes are predicated on the relationships that we have, our social capital that we have, that has nothing to do with what else you bring. But one of the things that was always affirmed at TNTP was how important my connection was to the students that we were trying to serve. And that's the thing that I try to reinforce to leaders of color, that our proximity to our communities is our superpower. And it's our responsibility to uplift sort of the day-to-day lives of the communities that we serve, to ensure that we are getting the funding and the resources for the populations that we care most about. So that's a little bit of our story at EdLock.
Awesome. That was fantastic. So Nick, you're in a different seat. You have been a philanthropic leader for a while, and you've taken an education foundation and made its focus racial equity. So talk a little bit about what you've learned on your journey about this kind of moving from talking the talk to walking the walk.
Great. Thank you, Celine. And I just want to start by saying thanks to you, Hannah and GFE, for hosting this. And, I come here with a real sense of humility. I think that's part of what I've learned along the way. So I'm just honored to be here with Layla and Xiomara, and just, want to be, I'm self-conscious of, representing the foundation. And it is true that we've made some progress. I've made some progress personally, but this is a long journey. I also want to just say that I'm very proud of some of the things we've done in Nellie May lately, but it really, rests on the work of our staff and really our board, who had the courage to kind of take this on and the patience to work with me and us and just seeing us through this. So good, my relation, a couple of things I've learned along the way is just the depth and value of the relationships in the work. I'm a very social person. I'm a friendly guy. I like, people. But, a lot of times I think the way part of the oppression works is it dehumanizes us, and we get told sort of lies about the difference between work and life and who we are as people and who we are as workers. And there's no reason why you can't bring those things together. So, the lessons are many. One is obviously that it's about, what you do and what you decide to do in terms of behavior and strategy. And, we've shifted from advancing particular models of education, very proud of the work we did around student-centered learning and trying to advance personalization and more customization in the field. But it's really much more about the culture and the beliefs and values on which those activities rest. I mean, it sounds so obvious saying it. So I think the strength of our work is about the inspection and self-reflection that we've done, both about the field and how to work with people and build different relationships, but really also about inspecting our internal culture around, how does white dominant culture work at Nellie May? What can we do to rebalance the conversations internally? And it's, been a lesson about trusting people, really providing a situation where people can use their full minds, can bring their courageous thoughts to bear. And, along the way, I think a big moment for me as a white middle-class man who identifies as, in many ways, the checklist of sort of what people think are mainstream characteristics, that the real insight a while ago is I'd been a progressive liberal person, but often sort of like a lot of white people, choosing when to step off the sidelines and into the game, and then, taking a timeout when I wanted to. And, I've just come to see the real power and influence of white culture in our society, in our industry, and in education in particular. And I never really thought about whiteness as a kind of dynamic and a force, but now it's, every moment I can sort of see the ether in which we walk, which is this thick, people described it like walking around in the bottom of a swimming pool where the water is just, rich with particular cultural, aspects of how whiteness dominates our world. And for some of us, it's easy to walk through that. It feels like air, but for others, particularly people of color, it's strenuous, it's exhausting to navigate that world. So I would say my empathy has increased significantly through these relationships. I've just come to see, the world differently. It's become more painful in terms of really understanding what people go through. I'm not trying to pretend like I understand firsthand the oppression of racism in our culture, but I'm much more aware of it. So I think the learnings along the way in terms of philanthropy are, you can program your way forward, but you really need to culture and belief your way to pave the way. So none of this would have happened without our board. I want to particularly thank Jan Flieger, our past board chair, a long-term colleague of mine who helped shepherd this forward during her tenure as board chair. Greg Gunn, my current board chair, carrying the torch forward and just keeping us honest about what we're doing. So I think in summary, the learnings are, it's about self-honesty. It's about the relationships. It's about listening to people. It's about, I made a lot of progress in my work life, presenting as self-confident and certain and saying what I think. And, I've discovered the richness of listening a little more and really just trying to help bring people together for a common purpose. So again, I'm going to end my little intro where I began, which is this is a journey. I'm glad we've made progress. I've made progress, but, as I've built relationships around me, I've learned there's nothing as dangerous as a partially awoke white, dominant male. So I'm trying to maintain my humility and perspective and, not act like I've got everything figured out, or we do. It's an ongoing process. So glad to be here.
Totally fair, and that's helpful. So first, I just want to lift up that there's lots of positive energy in the chat box. So thank you all. I think we can all use some positive energy these days, and I think our speakers are resonating so far, which is great. I want to encourage people to add questions where they have questions, and we're going to get to those. But right now, I'd like to turn more directly to the COVID-19 crisis. So there's concern that funders will abandon recent efforts to prioritize funding leaders of color as they move to response mode. I'd like to start with Layla, maybe, because you kind of sit over a whole bunch of younger nonprofits. Do you believe this is the case? And what are we risking when we don't see, investing in leaders of color and kind of supporting communities through the COVID crisis as integrally related? Integrally.
Yeah. So I, as Celine mentioned, one of our 3 priorities is to invest in members directly. And so our grant-making arm, the Boulder Fund, has supported 21 leaders of color over the last 3 years and made over $2 million worth of investment, direct financial support, plus non-financial support that we offer in the form of a network, a community, access to coaching, strategic advisement as part of their grant. So over the last week, actually, we brought them together for our Boulder Fund Community Day because while we were planning on having them in person, we moved that convening to November. But we also, because we are in close contact with them, know that this crisis really requires that they have a community. We know that leadership can be very lonely, and so they needed that space to come together. And we're very cognizant of the fact that they are busy leaders, and so we want to make sure that those hours that we ask them to spend with us are really a good use of their time. And just in talking to them, we know that fundraising is one of the things that is top of mind for them. They are very worried about fundraising right now, and so we spent a good amount of time just talking about best practices in fundraising during this time, sharing intel, what we're hearing. And one of the key challenges that they face is that, they're all fundraising for those strategic plans that they've created, those 2 to 3 year strategic plans. And at the same time, they're trying to be responsive to their stakeholders. But they are finding that those pools of dollars are still separate, right? Which requires them to talk to funders about their strategic plans over here and separately talk to funders about their real-time responses to the communities that they serve. So we're talking about people that work directly with youth. We have a principal who runs Van Ness Elementary School in the DC Public Schools. We have people who work directly with LGBT youth who are in homes that may not be sort of the most welcoming to them. We have people who are working directly with teachers and with students. And what is happening is that because they're so proximate to the communities, they're trying to respond to the needs that are popping up around food, housing, families that are now unemployed, young people who are now unemployed, who often contribute to their family income. And those pools of money continue to be separate, and they're trying to figure out how they bring those two together and how to do it strategically so that as they talk to funders, they are seen as one and the same. And one of the things that we talked about is that it's a mistake if we see our DEI work separate from our response to COVID now and in the next few years, because we know that this crisis is going to have implications for students, for teachers, for principals, for systems, for many more years to come. And I think about it as if you look at Reform 1.1, maybe like After the Nation at Risk, right, or Reform 2.0, the growth of charter schools, we pushed into the communities. are solutions, oftentimes absent of any of the voice of the people that were most affected. And my hope is that during this time, we learn from those mistakes and we're able to see that the support of leaders of color and the response to the crisis are integrally related. Because what you want to do is ensure that your response is closely aligned to the needs of the communities that you're trying to serve. And the people that are most proximate to those communities are oftentimes leaders of color. And those are the voices and the practices and the policy recommendations that need to be informed by people of color, by leaders of color in this time. And so one of the things that we did during our time together with our Boulder Fund grantees is start talking to them about their voice, what they're seeing on the ground, and ways that we can elevate like what the real time needs are right now, and thinking 6 to 12 months down the line, what the needs are that are now absent. Because we already, as much as I love policy and education policy, we're all seeing a lot of policy wonks lining up with their recommendations, and we continue to see an absence of the people who are, of the voice of the people who are most affected. And I think that's a big mistake, and this is an opportunity for us to learn what we didn't get right in Reform 1.0 or 2.0 and get it right this time, because those two things are very much connected.
That's great. I'm going to turn to Xiomara. You know, this challenge of talking to funders and saying, you know, I have this plan and these things I've already talked to you about doing, that's our long-term strategy, and now we need to pivot. That's complicated even if you are a more experienced fundraiser and a longer standing leader. So talk a little bit about your journey on that in this moment. Talk a little bit about the challenges of having a real kind of authentic two-way dialogue between funders and those running nonprofits, especially leaders of color.
Yeah. You know, I think that in any circumstance, in normal, I don't even want to use the word normal anymore, right? Like in pre-COVID circumstances, you know, the power dynamics between funders and grantees can be really palpable and hard to navigate. I think that there's probably a number of reasons that contribute to that. In my perspective, I think things like, you know, is there a values alignment at the start? You know, if there is, then you have that always to go back to. If there isn't, then it's always going to be a rift. You know, are all parties treating the relationship like a transactional exchange of money for deliverables, or a complex and dynamic relationship between humans that's really aiming to bring together resources on the one hand with skills and experiences in service of a common goal? Those are totally different approaches into the relationship that will continue to play out over and over and over again. So I would say, you know, in my experience right now, honestly, there are a lot of different responses that I'm, as a grantee, just literally as a grantee, there's a lot of different responses that I'm seeing right now. And I would say, I would probably categorize them as like really super lovely and loving in intention, and really super mixed in impact. And what I mean, and I'll just get really specific. I mean, you said like speak truth, so I will get really specific and say as a grantee, the most common offer from funders right now who are legitimately, clearly trying to help that I'm experiencing is, to put it really plainly, and this is not the word usually being used, no problem to move the milestone due dates, but the money goes with the dates. And as a leader attempting to drive work forward, keep the doors open, keep my people employed, while the intention there is clearly good, you know, flexibility and responsiveness and empathy is the intention, the actual impact is very little. Because at the end of the day, what I need to do that, keeping of the doors open to keep the work moving forward and my people employed, is the dollars now in order to keep all that stuff going. And so what that means is I don't have the flexibility to take funders up on what I know is an honest offer to move dates, milestone due dates to later because I need the funding now. So I think that's like the most common thing I'm seeing, just to get really specific and tactical. And I know it comes from a good place and the intention is really good, but at the end of the day, the way it lands, it's not something I can take advantage of that's going to create a meaningful impact. On the flip side, and this is what I mean by there's been a real mix, there are a few funders in my world anyway, and I'm sure there's a number in other people's worlds as well, but just to speak to my own personal experience, where there have been some much bolder actions that are creating way more material, positive, immediate impact for me. So some examples, like CZI, we have a relationship with CZI at Promise 54. They've shifted a substantial 2020 grant for us from to a Gen Ops grant, and they've advanced payment on the outstanding disbursements for this year. And it took like one conversation with my program officer in a 2-minute form. And literally the process was like super simple, super fast, and the impact is going to be massive on our ability to keep the work moving forward this year. And it conveys real like trust in the partnership that we have, because it conveys to me that they know we're going to keep the work moving forward. Because we turn it to Gen Ops does not mean we're going to bring the work to a screeching halt. There's just no way. So it conveys that trust in the relationship, and it just sort of deepens the investment. Schusterman and I believe a number of other funders, but I don't know the details, joined together to help a bunch of leaders of color to get access to technical assistance to guide us through the PPP application process. It was basically like hooking us up with a person to shepherd us all the way through until we got our approved official loan number, which we got like hours ago, not days ago. But the impact is absolutely massive on our ability to keep things moving this year. Or like another example is Ed4 DC, which is another funder we work with a lot, has loosened requirements for some of the milestones, so that even though we can only partially meet a milestone because of COVID-19 complexities, they're still approving the disbursement of the full funding. And they and a number of others, New Schools Venture Fund, CDI, have been putting together optional webinars to help leaders navigate through this time, scenario planning and budgeting and fundraising, all in the context of how to kind of make it through crisis. So just to get a little bit more specific as a grantee, those are some of my experiences. And I think what I know to be true is that what I have experienced is complete consistency in the desire to help, but the avenue or the strategies or the tactics have a totally different impact in terms of how much they're actually able to create help right now. And some of those bolder moves, honestly, are creating really material help right now, while some of the less bold moves are like a nice statement of intention, and I know it's real, but it's not actually helping me move stuff forward, continue to move stuff forward.
Yeah, I would just like to.
Go ahead, Layla.
Yeah, sorry. I was just gonna follow on to what Xiomara was saying, which is that we had a similar experience with CDI, just in terms of their desire to help. They knew that, you know, I had a conversation with our program officer. They knew that we were moving our systems leader convening to November, and we also had a deep desire to want to do something now for systems leaders who are part of our network. And they stepped up and they said, like, we are going to offer some funding right now, and moved very quickly through that process to get the money in the door, because even though, you know, we are all about providing real-time support to members, this was programming that we were adding on top of what we already had planned. And they recognized that and said, here's some additional funding to help you. Same thing with Schusterman, sort of providing that technical support, because we know that so many leaders of color and nonprofits were locked out of the PPP for the first time. And really it was dependent on how hard your loan officer was willing to work for you. And if you were not values and mission aligned, they weren't working very hard for you. That's what we heard from our members. And so we pushed out a lot of the communication that was coming out of Schusterman to ensure that our members were getting that kind of support throughout the process. And I think that those kinds of things have a huge impact in our ability, right? The intel, the access to some of these supports, like, is all about what we do at EdLock for our members. The third thing that I would say, just on, you know, sort of what has been less helpful, is at times we are getting the message that this is not the time to reach out to new funders because they are focused on supporting their existing grantees. As leaders of color, we feel like we don't have that luxury. We can't just not reach out. And so what would be really helpful is understanding that foundations are dealing with their own, you know, working from home situations, right? Some, you know, we recognize that our foundation partners are people too, right? They're making the transition from working from home, they're making the transition with kids in the home, or et cetera, and dealing with their own staff and the implications. All of those things are going on. What would be helpful is said, like, if the time is not now because you're dealing with the own implications for your own organization, telling us when would be the right time, because completely shutting out potentially new grantees is going to take a big hit, particularly for leaders of color who are trying to cultivate some of those relationships with funders who may not have supported their strategic plan, but they may have supported some of this real-time response that they're doing for communities of color, or would be supporting that, but maybe not their strategic plan, but maybe would do it now, to hearing, if not now, then when, because completely closing the door is going to have detrimental impact on a lot of these organizations that we're trying to sustain.
That's great. Nick, I'd love for you to weigh in on what you all have been trying to do or what you've seen across the philanthropic community about response and flexibility and changes in grant making practice.
Sure. I want to start just by naming a couple of resources for people who are thinking about philanthropy and who are interested in kind of just digging in on the power relationships and the effect of white supremacy culture. And so I would just recommend National Council for Responsive Philanthropy has a piece called Power Moves, which is just, fantastic. It lays out a framework about how to think about philanthropy through a lens of equity. Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva is a really interesting piece on, think about philanthropy both through a historic lens and shining a light on the issues of indigenous people and the connection between the two, and then Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. I think, as I said, my theme is, I think a lot of white people have been working on this topic as an ally around, trying to limit racism, but there's really a lot of work to do that we get to do ourselves to kind of contribute in some different ways. So I think it was interesting for us because we had spent a number of years sort of reflecting on who we were and getting ready to launch a new strategy, which we just began this year. And our focus was really had shifted from kind of advance a particular practice and sharing our ideas about what was good and just turning that around and really adopting a perspective that people closest to community actually knew what to do. And so our new mission is about championing community developed goals that challenge racial inequities and advance excellent student-centered public education. So we stay interested in that, but the real shift for us was to start distributing unrestricted grants to let people follow the aspirations they had developed. So we shifted from being kind of more instructive and the know-it-all paternalism that describes many people like myself in philanthropy to listening and really trying to follow the direction of people who were doing the work. So that was kind of interesting. And then the COVID piece came up. So we wanted to continue on the path of doing our strategy to support people because it's fundamental to giving people resources to do things. But even in that context, we obviously, needed to make a move to do some more immediate things. We're a regional foundation. We serve the 6 New England states. There'll be a test in the chat box later for people who know what those 6 states are, right? But that means that we needed to build and connect with people closer to the ground. So we made contributions pretty quickly to folks who were organizing in communities or at the state level. So we distributed some resources there. And then early on, we provided what is now going to be just a couple $100,000 to a fund that we developed called Racism is a Virus Too. That was an effort to support leaders in the Asian American community to combat some of the just terrible, inhuman reactions that, many Americans display to people who seem like they may be of Asian American descent, really taking out on them their fear and concerns. And so I'm very glad that we stepped in there. I want to credit Ellen Wang from our staff who kind of, spearheaded that. And I'm just glad we stepped forward to, make a statement about that it's not okay to then start cursing or spitting or showing public loathing for a member of our members of our community. One thing I've noticed is kind of interesting is that there are positive things. I think philanthropy in many ways is stepping up, in particular ways. And what's interesting to me is that, I was at a meeting the other day where we had a long-term strategy conversation with a group of funders, and then we had this immediate, COVID conversation. And the immediate COVID conversation was driven by supporting vulnerable communities, getting behind communities of color, supporting those most harmed and most at risk. And then we switched to the long-term strategy conversation. Once again, it turned into a conversation about everybody. Let's treat everybody the same. So we went from this targeted focused conversation that felt sort of more righteous and indicated, and then we flipped back to a long-term strategy conversation that was about advancing everybody as though everything's the same. And I thought it was interesting to raise with that group. I said, you know, it's interesting how we're in the crisis now and we're focusing on those who are most vulnerable and really trying to leverage leadership of people who are closest to the action. But it's easy for those of us who are privileged and comfortable to forget that in normal times, these communities are in crisis as well. You know, and it's just this amnesia we get. The design of, you know, racism just has us forget that, you know, yeah, things are much tougher now for many people. And when we get through COVID, you know, these communities are still going to be in crisis. So why can't we act like that every day, not just days when things are so bad that we kind of, you know, come to our senses briefly. So that's concerning to me. I see it's some kind of opportunity, trying to figure out how to leverage that with people and to bring that forward. So, but I think, you know, we've been also trying to do some of the things talked about. I'm very glad to hear about other foundations. We're not the first to do this. We're not the best at it, but we just send a notice to our grantees saying, if you need to repurpose some monies, let us know, talk to us about what that's about for you. And it just seems like, you know, one of the filters I put on it is like, this is not a complicated business for philanthropy. Like, what does it mean to act like intelligent human beings who care about society? And just, if you just think about acting in a way that's consistent with the values you espouse, you know, that is the secret sauce to this, is just walking the talk and listening to people. And I think, you know, philanthropy is doing okay, but is still limited by the sort of the virus that infects philanthropy, which is the dominance of white people and, you know, white voices and white privileged voices. So we still have further to go, but I'm proud of what our sector has done to some degree. And I get to see more and more because of the work we're in and the position we're in, we see more of the positive moves, but we also hear and, you know, listen to people tell us about the mistakes philanthropy is making today in terms of continuing to apply its sort of arrogant self-centeredness and self-assuredness on the field, to apply that sense of knowing better than the people, that paternalistic kind of sense of, well, things are so hard for people, you know, we need to think for them, not with them. And I think that's just a terrible sign of our times.
Xiomara, let me turn it over to you on DEI now versus, you know, the cost of acting now versus not acting now.
Yeah, and Nick, your comments made me think of this too. Is like, I'm hearing tons of talk around this idea of, you know, can we afford to continue to focus on diversity, inclusion, and equity now in this crazy time of crisis? And on the flip side, can we afford not to? And so I feel like there's a lot of noise around that right now. And honestly, for what it's worth, for me, it comes down to like 3 simple things. And honestly, any of the 3 are enough, but all of the 3 are true. One of them, honestly, is like, just if we think about the kids we exist to serve, the equity gaps in education along the lines of identity, specifically race and class, are getting exponentially worse right now in this moment because of this pandemic. So for the kids and families we serve, we just cannot afford not to be focused on equity. The second piece is, if we think about the adults that we work alongside and that we lead in times of crisis and extreme stress, it's like this double thing happens and it comes head to head. We as leaders are most at risk because of the extreme stress of defaulting to habitual, pre-learned, pre-programmed behaviors, including white supremacy culture behaviors in our leadership and our decision-making and our communication. And this is the very moment that, because of the crisis, our people most need us to approach our leadership from a compassionate place of full humanity, where we really take care of our people. They can show up fully, they can find belonging and connection and affirmation and support. And so those 2 things are happening at the same time, which to me means we absolutely must, for the adults that are doing this work, that we work alongside and that we lead, we must stay focused on inclusion and equity. And then if neither of those are enough, which, by the way, like I said, I think either of those are enough, but let's just say for someone neither were enough, then we can go to the pure business case, which you know, there's some really interesting research that a continued focus on diversity, inclusion, and equity, especially inclusion and equity, can actually help organizations persist through crisis. And there were some studies around the 2007 to 2009 recession that actually looked at this exact question and found that companies that prioritized DEI actually outperformed less inclusive companies by 400% on the stock exchange. And that while the S&P saw nearly like a 40% decline in that period, companies whose staff experienced the organization as inclusive actually saw a 14+% gain. So even if we have to go to the business case says that, you know, if we continue this focus on inclusion and equity through crisis, it will help us to persist and be standing on the other end. I mean, at the end of the day, from my perspective, the noise around, like, can we afford to do DEI? It's a thing on our list, and we have to prioritize and competing priorities. It all sort of, it's kind of misguided, because at the end of the day, the way I see it, the way we see it at Promise 54 is really this idea of like inclusion and equity, even diversity. It's not a thing we do on our list that can come on or off when we have competing priorities and stress and tension and pressures. It's how we do everything. And the how we do everything can't shift in moments of crisis. In fact, we have to double down on the how we do everything in order to persist through. So those are my honest thoughts on that question of, can we afford to keep doing DEI, or can we afford not to do inclusion and equity work in this time? I just think it's an absolute must.
Totally. And go ahead, Nick.
So I just am glad Xiomara said that. So when we started our work, you know, the first goal of the effort was to be more effective in what we did. You know, there's a value basis here. There's being just and acting consistent with values. But, you know, we at Nellie Mae are doing much better together as a group because of the work we did internally on facing the white dominant culture and racism. I mean, we're a better prepared organization for this time. You know, still far to go, not a completely liberated workplace, but you know, heading in that direction. And I wanted to say, I appreciate that. It's not, this isn't icing on the cake, you know, it's the blood in your veins and how it makes you operate. And, you know, for folks who are, and I engage with a lot of people, you know, significantly, I hear from white leaders, and I'm sort of a safe person for people to kind of ask their questions to, but I do get questions about like, well, why are you doing this? And is this really the time? And, you know, doesn't it disrupt things? And the answers are yes, yes, and yes. You know, they disrupt things, and it is the right time. So I wanted to, I'm not saying it as clearly as I wanted to, but I just think you know, it's okay to care about the quality of your work. And if you care about the quality of your work, then facing whiteness and, you know, cultural issues around racism and dominant culture just are, you just have to do it. I don't think you'd be effective without it. So.
Now, let me just say to our audience, we're getting close to the top of the hour, so I do want to encourage you, questions in the chat box, I will make sure I get to them. But Layla, I liked your framing, and this has kind of been touched on in some ways by our other panelists over the past few minutes of, you know, Ed Reform 1.0 and Ed Reform 2.0 were kind of characterized as top down. There were some leaders, they had some ideas, they inflicted them or offered them to communities, depending on how you look at it. So I think we all know, to achieve our equity gain ends, we need to, you know, have a more bottoms up approach to the thought of Ed Reform 3.0. What do you see as some of the most important markers for that, how that should play out? And then number two, for each of you, where does that leave funders? What's the role of funders in a more community-driven effort to improve schools? So Layla, I'll start with you, since you offered that really smart frame.
Yep. I mean, I think that one of the criteria that you should look at, you know, as funders is, you know, what kind of value are you assigning to proximity, right? And does it, where is that in your list of priorities as you're looking at the leader and potential sustainability and the theory of change? Where does proximity fit into that criteria? I would say that one of the things that we have prioritized as well is that values alignment, right? We want leaders and ideas that are aligned to the values that we've articulated as a community of leaders of color. So I would look at that too. And I would say the third thing is, particularly at this time, but as Nick was saying, and I wholeheartedly agree, that our communities have been in crisis for a very long time, and our siloed approaches to solving educational issues have not gotten us the results that we want. And so the other thing that we are, that we would want to see is, to what extent are the solutions from the people that you're investing cross-sector and intersectional in nature? Because our kids and our families, just like us, lead intersectional lives. And so to what extent are the ideas out there sort of siloed, focused on one thing, but not acknowledging the factors around students and families that impact whether when kids show up to school at some point, virtually or in person, they can meet their full potential. And we think that the siloed approach just has not worked for us, and we need to think more holistically and need to align that funding to those approaches. So proximity, values alignment, and intersectional approaches to solving this issue, because I can guarantee you that if a system or an organization thinks that they're going to solve all the challenges that are being exacerbated by COVID-19 by just having an educational approach, you're going to miss a lot of students. We're going to miss a lot. And I think that Reform 1.0 and 2.0 has given us all the evidence that we need in order to ensure that, when you know better, you can actually do better.
Xiomara?
I mean, I love all those thoughts. I don't have a ton to add. I think the only thing, I would +1 on all of that. And I guess the only thing I would really add is maybe like a +1 on the proximity piece with a question, really, like, let's keep asking ourselves, and I would encourage especially folks working in philanthropic organizations to keep asking yourselves, where are you getting your information? Who are you listening to? Who's informing your strategies and your thinking and your actions? I mean, I would even say, like, and take it granular, right? Like, all leaders of color are not the same. We don't have the same experiences. We don't have the same perspectives or access. Layla and Nick, I know both of you from before, and we have strong relationships, and I love you both. And also, we don't have any leaders of color who are leading school systems on this very panel, who are in most proximity to families and communities and kids and navigating through the realities of the day-to-day right now. And so I would just encourage, like, in your day-to-day, as you think about what to do to try to support, where are you getting your information? Who are you talking to? And if you need help getting access in closer proximity, like, reach out and ask for it, because folks are out here and, have those experiences. And I'm sure with the safety and, parameters around the relationship, we'll share that experience and what we need. So I guess that's all I would really add on the proximity point, but I love all the things that Layla said before.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And yes, to all. And Nick, quick final word. We're just about at time.
I would just say, the work is challenging, it's confusing, and it's essential. And, there are a growing community of people who are trying to think about this. I think one thing to think about sort of fundamentally for philanthropy is that, in many ways, it's easy to forget that it's really not our money. That the money developed in philanthropy was sort of over time kind of built on the backs of people who are generating wealth. They're great entrepreneurs who've accumulated wealth, but it's happened because of racism, not, despite it. So if you take the perspective, I think an important thing for people in philanthropy to think about is that we often operate from a charity-based frame, like we're doing good and we're doing someone a favor, versus a reparations frame or a mutual aid frame. And we're not all the way in that frame at Nellie Mae, but it helps me remember that, there's an obligation here to support and grow a just society. It's not just a nice thing to do or a favor we're doing anybody. It's just what humans do to help each other. I mean, philanthropy is rooted in the word love, and that's what its origins are meant to be. So I'll stop there, and I'd like not to be the last word. So I don't know if somebody else wants to close us.
I think I have to, because I want to be respectful of people's time. I do want to thank all three of you. This is weighty work. This is an early step for us as an organization. I think it's a really necessary one, and I can tell by the size of the crowd that enrolled that this is something that people want to continue to talk about here and try to learn from those who are a little bit more proximate. So thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for taking the time today and helping us on our journey. I really appreciate it. Have a good rest of the day, people, and hopefully at least we can get a little bit, get outside a little bit this weekend. All right, thank you so much. Have a great day all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Layla and Xiomara.
Thank you.